everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today, Crisis Pregnancy Centers, Misleading and Biased. We are honored to have you on the call. This webinar is co-sponsored by the UCLA Law's Center on Reproductive Health, Law and Policy and the Bixby Center on Population and Reproductive Health. Before we get started, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. So just so everyone is aware, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available at the end to all participants. Another thing is that the presenters today will take their time to go over their own presentations, and we'll leave about 10 minutes at the end for any questions from the audience. So if you have a question while the presenters are going through their own presentations, please go ahead and put those in the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. And like I said, add questions while our speakers are presenting. So without further ado, I am very excited to introduce our speakers for today. So we have Cathren Cohen, who's a staff attorney at UCLA Law, Center on Reproductive Health, Law and Policy, and at the Williams Institute. We also have Paula Tavrow, who's the director of the Bixby program in Population and Reproductive Health at the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. Welcome.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to share my screen. Do you see just the presentation?
We see we don't see there now. We see the full presentation.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Hi, my name is Cathren Cohen, and as Carly said, I'm a staff attorney at the Center on Reproductive Health, Law and Policy. Thanks for coming to our event on crisis pregnancy centers, a part of UCLA Sex Week. I'm going to start with a little bit of background on crisis pregnancy centers before I pass it over to my colleague Paula. And I wanted to first emphasize this excellent report from the Alliance for State Advocates for Women's Rights and Gender Equality, the Design to Deceive report, which is the source of a lot of the information I'm going to be presenting today. So thank you to the wonderful organizations who put this report together, and in particular, the California Women's Law Center, who have done the specific report on California. I'm going to focus on California, given our location. But first, a background. What are crisis pregnancy centers? Crisis pregnancy centers, or CPCs, are anti-abortion organizations that seek to reach low-income people facing unintended pregnancy and prevent them from accessing abortion and sometimes as well contraception. They will often offer free services that are designed to get people to enter the crisis pregnancy center so that they are able to then share their information. And some of the services that they may provide for free are things like pregnancy tests, ultrasounds, and diapers. Although, as I will talk about more later, the ultrasounds are not really a medical service. A lot of this is focused on, again, this deception. So in addition, crisis pregnancy centers will often use misleading and coercive tactics and information in order to dissuade visitors from seeking abortions. And while they present themselves as medical clinics, most do not have medical staff. So some statistics about crisis pregnancy centers in California, again, from the Design to Deceive 2022 update for California. In late 2022, the California Women's Law Center identified 165 crisis pregnancy centers in California, which means that they outnumber legitimate abortion clinics by a ratio of 5 to 4. In the report, they looked at all of these different crisis pregnancy centers and found the following, that 90% of CPCs in California offer no prenatal care. None of the crisis pregnancy centers identified offered contraceptive care. 75% have no physicians on staff, and only 32% have a registered nurse affiliated with the center, which means that at some point they might have a nurse there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there is someone there at all times who's an actual medical provider. In addition, 58% offer what are called non-diagnostic ultrasounds. And so while a medically diagnostic ultrasound would be able to do things like date the pregnancy or identify a ectopic pregnancy or other complications, a non-diagnostic ultrasound is sometimes called a keepsake keepsake ultrasound. It's really just designed to create an image that someone could potentially form an emotional attachment to, as that that is really the motivation behind for CPCs, but it cannot identify complications. And so it puts pregnant people at risk of thinking they've gotten a diagnostic scan of their early pregnancy when they may not have. In addition, the report found that 66% of CPCs in California provide either false or biased medical claims. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about kind of the different misleading medical claims that are frequently made. And then in addition, 37% promote what is called abortion pill reversal, which is an untested and unethical sort of pseudoscience, which is not based in medical evidence. The argument is that you can take a pill after taking the first abortion pill, and that can reverse the abortion pill. The experts do not support this. There is not strong medical research showing that it is possible to reverse an abortion pill. And the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists have called this practice unethical and not based in science. A little bit more about the kinds of false claims that crisis pregnancy centers might make. I want to highlight these so folks who might run into a crisis pregnancy center or hear these myths can know that these are not legitimate or not supported by legitimate evidence. So a lot of the times these claims are made to try to dissuade visitors from seeking abortion practices. And so they will say things like that there are very serious health concerns from having an abortion. For example, you frequently hear that the argument that abortion causes breast cancer, can cause difficulty getting pregnant in the future, infertility, damage to the cervix, or causes future defects. And then also there is a lot of emphasis on serious mental health impacts and abortion regret, which again is not supported by the evidence. None of these health conditions are actual consequences of abortion. Abortion is safer than pregnancy and childbirth. But there is an over-exaggeration of these harms in order to dissuade people from seeking abortions. In addition, CPCs will frequently mislead pregnant people about the gestational age of their pregnancy, and that's in order to, again, prevent access to abortion care. So they will either say that the pregnancy is too far along and it is too late to get an abortion in the person's state, or they will go the opposite direction. They'll say that it is very early in the pregnancy and that the person still has lots of time in order to prevent them from feeling the urgency of going and seeking an abortion from a legitimate clinic. I mentioned before, they provide free keepsake or souvenir ultrasounds that, again, are not diagnostic and are not able to identify complications or get an accurate date for the pregnancy. And then frequently you will also see very inflammatory language used to describe abortion if they talk about it at all, such as, for example, saying that you are killing a baby, or just kind of very inflammatory and biased language in describing abortion procedures. So then I wanted to talk about how to distinguish a CPC from a real clinic, in particular for people who might be seeking services and might not know whether or not they are seeing a real medical provider, going to a real clinic, or are being advertised for a CPC. I think this is really important to mention because CPCs often locate themselves right next door to real abortion clinics or other reproductive health care centers. And sometimes we'll even put people out front to direct people into the wrong location. So this image on the top left, the people standing there in the pink vests are Planned Parenthood clinic escorts. They are volunteers with Planned Parenthood, and this is outside a Planned Parenthood clinic. Whereas the person with the arrow pointing to them in the kind of more yellow or the more orange vest is a CPC volunteer, and she is trying to direct people into a CPC rather than a crisis pregnancy center. So the location is one tell. In addition, billboards like the one at the top right are the kinds of messaging that you frequently see for CPCs. Their ads will often be directed towards people who are pregnant and scared, pregnant and alone, people who need help. And then they also very frequently use terms like choice or options in their name. And that's another kind of tell that what you're dealing with is a CPC rather than a clinic. In addition, 70% of CPCs in the country are affiliated with large national groups. And so identification with any of those groups is, again, a good way to identify a CPC. The major groups that operate CPCs in the US are Heartbeat International, CareNet, and the National Institute of Family and Life Advocates. Additional points to distinguish a CPC from a real clinic. Very often they will stress abstinence or fertility awareness instead of contraception. These are all screenshots from different crisis pregnancy centers in California. And you can see on the left, one of the services offered at the CPC is abstinence education. And there's some language here kind of demeaning towards contraception and premarital sex. In addition, there are, again, mentions of abortion pill reversal or really overemphasis on post-abortion services or trauma from abortion is, again, a red flag. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that, again, as we have in the heading of this presentation, misleading is a big tactic. Being misleading is a big tactic of CPCs. And so frequently, if you call a CPC, they will not be clear about whether or not they provide abortion care or not, because their goal is to get people to come into the center so they can talk to them more. If you are calling a legitimate abortion clinic and ask if they provide abortions, they will tell you. And so that is a good thing to know when you are trying to seek abortion care. And then I wanted to share just a few resources for especially students in the UCLA area of how to find legitimate abortion clinics and care. First is kind of the opposite, is this resource of crisispregnancycentermap.com, which is a map of all crisis pregnancy centers. It's crowdsourced, and so it's constantly being updated. That is the image of the map of California. Those are locations of crisis pregnancy centers in the state. To counter this map of places where you don't want to go if you are seeking an abortion is the UCLA Student Health and Education Program's Sexual Wellness Map, which is on the UCLA SHEP website. This is the little graphic that they have, and if you click on that, there is an interactive map where people can find reproductive and sexual health resources in the LA area and especially close to UCLA. In addition, a few resources, Planned Parenthood. Not all Planned Parenthoods provide abortion care, but if you call a Planned Parenthood or go there for other sexual reproductive health care, they will be able to refer you to a legitimate abortion clinic if they do not provide that care. And in addition, there are online resources both to find in-clinic and telehealth abortions, including abortionfinder.org, ineedanaid.org, and Plan C Pills. And then I wanted to just end with a little bit of information about advocacy that is being done to expose crisis pregnancy centers and kind of raise awareness. One is the website and effort of #ExposeFakeClinics, which is operated and run with a bunch of different reproductive justice and reproductive rights organizations. They have a whole list of advocacy and opportunities on their websites, and also just materials in order to talk to other people about crisis pregnancy centers and share the kinds of information that we provided today. There's also a couple of potential sources for legislative advocacy that I wanted to mention. While in many states, crisis pregnancy centers will receive actual state contracts to provide care, that is not the case here in California, luckily. However, some still receive some funding through the Title X Family Planning Program, and the few that have actual providers, healthcare providers, may be receiving Medi-Cal reimbursement. So that is a potential source to fight back. In addition, wanted to mention AB 315, which is a piece of legislation here in California this year, which would prohibit anyone doing business in the state to advertise with false or misleading information related to the provision of abortion or the fact that they do not provide abortion. This bill, I believe, went through the Appropriations Committee this morning. It is currently working its way through the state legislature. And so calling your representatives to support this legislation is one thing that folks can do if they want to do advocacy against crisis pregnancy centers. And now I'm going to pass it to Paula.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for that excellent talk. So my name is Paula Tavrow. I am an adjunct professor in the Department of Community Health Sciences at UCLA Fielding School of Public Health, and also a director of the Bixby program at the School of Public Health. So my talk today is entitled Assessing Racial Ethnic Bias in U.S. Crisis Pregnancy Centers. And this study was funded by the Office of Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity at the Fielding School of Public Health, as well as the Barbara Streisand Center at UCLA. And I also want to acknowledge my wonderful co-investigators who are all at the time students, Andrea Renteria, Judy Tang, and Monica Zepeda. Next. So the starting point for this study was actually an important statement that came out in July 2019 from the American Academy of Family Physicians, in which they really called upon researchers to acknowledge that there is a system of racism in the country, that some settings, in some places, racism has been institutionalized, and that we should all be conducting a comprehensive and critical examination of policies and procedures in various institutions to ferret out any racism or expose it where it might exist. Next. So I decided to focus on crisis pregnancy centers. Crisis pregnancy centers, Catherine explained so thoroughly to us, but just so that you're aware, they were begun in the 1960s, and it was in response to the liberalization of US abortion laws. So it was always, in some ways, political. And interestingly enough, the very first crisis pregnancy centers were in Hawaii. And then they slowly, or rather quickly, actually spread into the rest of the country. They have a very strong anti-abortion mission, as Catherine laid out, and they generally are nonprofits and mainly staffed with volunteers and non-medical personnel. So these are some examples. I think that what really stands out often is when they offer something free, like a free pregnancy test or free counseling or whatever it may be. That to me is often a red flag. Next. So in California, as Catherine said, there's about 156, but across the entire country, there's actually, if you can believe it, 2,555 that have been identified by a group that has created this map. And I believe right now it's estimated there are about 760 abortion clinics in the country. So you can see how, I mean, if it's 5 to 4 in California, they far outweigh that in other parts of the country. Next. So here is an example of a website, and you can see this is just, nearby East Los Angeles, but you can just see just how deceptive, as Catherine was pointing out, they are, helping those in need. And it seems that, they're offering, again, the free classes and so on. And so it's very hard. I mean, you have to really excavate these sites to figure out that they're not offering legitimate healthcare. Next. But what I think that a lot of people don't recognize is that they often are also trying to reach men or the male partners of a pregnant person. And so this is just an example. So sometimes they have a full, like men's corner for men. Sometimes it's just some testimonials or other things, but they are definitely trying to reach men. And in a companion study, we found that well over half, more like 2/3, actually have specific content for men. Next. So our study was to try to understand, how do crisis pregnancy centers treat men? Because all the prior research had focused on women. So we were interested, since they say that, they're trying to do outreach to men or offer services to men, what do they do? And we also wanted to understand if there were any racial ethnic differences or any racism that we could identify. Next. So our design was that we trained 7 male mystery callers from 3 ethnicities. That we had 2 white men, 2 Latinos, and 3 African American men. Our intent was initially to have 2 African Americans, but one had to leave the project because he got a full-time job. So then we took on a 3rd. We were in 8 states, 2 per time zone. We chose not to do research in the South or in Texas. In Texas, because it was a little fraught. This was prior to the Dobbs decision. In the South, because we didn't want our men to try to put on a Southern accent or something like that. So you'll see in just a moment, but we picked 8 states, of which California is one of them. Then what we did is we randomly assigned men to call different crisis pregnancy centers. So none of our mystery callers called the same site as another mystery caller, because we felt like if a clinic got 2 calls from men, they might get suspicious if it was, in a relatively short period of time. So we told the men that their goal was to get on, talk to somebody, and get off the call within about 10 minutes if they could. We were not allowed to do any kind of taping. It's illegal in California without the consent of whoever's being taped. Or we also did no eavesdropping on the calls. So our approach was instead that the man would dial a number, and the minute he finished his call, he would then turn and call a research assistant. We had a group of undergrads who were working with us, and then the undergrad would just quickly go through a whole survey with him and try to get as close as possible, verbatim, to what happened, what was said. And the man also often took little notes as the call was going on so that he would be able to respond well to the research assistant. They all used the same brief script, except for the small change that you'll see in just one moment. Next. So here is that brief script. So again, they all stuck to this script, which was, hello, I'm looking for some advice. I don't know if you can help me. I just found out that my girlfriend is pregnant. I'm trying to figure out what to do. Then often, the crisis pregnancy center will say, oh, you should bring her in, or what can we help you with, or whatever. And then they would say, I think she's considering an abortion. And then they would insert right away what their race was, and however they felt the most comfortable doing it. So with our Black men, they said, as a Black dude, or with our Latinos, they generally said as someone with Mexican parents, or with our white men, one said, someone of Irish heritage, another one said someone of Italian heritage. I'm a bit uncomfortable with that. So they wanted to insert right up front what their race was, plant that in the head of whoever they were talking to. And then not gotcha questions, just, I have a few questions. Can you give me some advice over the phone? Is abortion safe? How long do we have to decide whether to have an abortion? Any resources you would recommend? So just to see what these very basic, just trying to get information, questions, what they elicited from whoever was there at the Crisis Pregnancy Center. Next. So here's the final sample. As you can see, those were the states, and that P equals 0.939 indicates that they were randomly assigned. There was no difference by ethnicity and state. So our goal was about 100 completed calls per ethnicity, and as you can see, we had very close to that, 97, 98, 95 per ethnicity. And the time frame was November 22nd, 2021 through to June 8th, 2022. So we did end before the Dobbs decision came down. Next. So when it came to how many minutes per call, our men were able to keep to our goal of about 10. And as you can see, there was no difference by ethnicity. In general, they were on the call about 11 minutes. But there was a real wide range. So all the way from 2 minutes on a call, like that someone just said, hey, you just have to come in, they just didn't want to talk to them, up to 27 minutes. And they went on and on and on. And the guy really had trouble extricating himself. Now, occasionally it was because they were put on hold for a while and they were told to stay on hold for at least 5 minutes, and wait it out. Next. So again, there is no difference by ethnicity about how many people they talked to. Generally, they did just talk to one person, about 72%. But sometimes they talked to two people, and again, then they just return to their script again. And then, or very rarely, they actually talk to three people. So did they talk to a medical person? Actually, only in 14% of the time did somebody self-identify as being medical or being a nurse or what have you. In the vast majority, it didn't seem that they were talking to anyone with medical qualifications. Now we turn to where we did start to see some real differences by ethnicity. So first, we were wondering, did they take an interest in this man and or his partner? So each man had to come up with a little backstory about, if it was asked, his age or her age or gestational or pregnancy test and so on. And we tried to keep those as identical as we could. And if they would ask the race of your partner, it'd always be the same race as yours, but nobody did ask that. So this is where we start to see, as I mentioned, the differences. So how many questions were asked to understand this man or his situation? And what we found was that on average, they asked 3 questions of white men versus literally half that amount, 1.6 of Latinos and 2.1 of our white men. Where they asked them no questions at all and just said, hey, go elsewhere or come here, or, whatever. They just didn't really want to get involved with them. That happened only 12% of the time with the white men, and it happened about double that amount of time with the men of color. Next. So here you can see the questions that were asked of the clients. So, and you can see just really extraordinary differences. Again, remind yourself, the only difference, they were following the exact same script. They had been trained the same way. The only difference was just to insert that, as a Black dude or as a person of, Irish heritage. And these are the differences we found. So first, asked about last menstrual period. So you can see, asked gestational age, asked whether they took a pregnancy test. Again, the white men are almost all, or, the vast majority were asked this. And very few, like, look at that, take the pregnancy test. Only 10% even asked the Latino if his girlfriend had taken a pregnancy test versus nearly 53% asked that of a white male. Or asked why the girlfriend's contemplating an abortion, asked how long they've been together. The only one where it was the same was just asked where they live to just sort of determine if they could come in easily or if they were the nearest CPC. And the guys could say whatever. I mean, sometimes they'd say, I'd prefer not to say. That was also fine. And then the only interesting thing in this case where they asked more questions of the Black actors or Black callers than of anyone else was about their age. So 25% of our Black men were asked their age versus only 12 to 13% of our other men. Next. So next, did they try to discourage abortion? So remember, that is their mission, to discourage abortion. But we were curious to see, did they try equally to discourage abortion of all of these different individuals? And so we were looking at the amount of abortion misinformation. So as you can see, with white men, it was nearly 5 different things they claimed, consequences of abortion or the procedure, et cetera. Whereas only 2 items were mentioned on average for a Latino and about 2.8 for the Black callers. They also, as I mentioned, they try to scribble down what was said because they know they're just about to have to debrief. And in about a third of the cases, the white men wrote, it's just like they kept trying to scribble everything down. They couldn't get it all. So, 35%. This happened only 9% of the time for our Latinos and no percent of the time for our Black men. Next. So here's an example of this misinformation told to a male caller. This is told to a white mystery caller in Arizona. Abortions do harm. Your girlfriend can actually die during the procedure. Heavy bleeding is normal, but hemorrhage can happen. She can have an embolism. The surgical procedure can puncture her, damaging organs. Fetal parts can be left inside and an infection can happen. She could have an allergic reaction. She can't have future babies if the organs are damaged. There's a 7-fold risk of suicide after abortion. There's a syndrome called post-abortion syndrome, and sometimes there are anxieties, flashbacks, and intense anger. It makes women more promiscuous. It can cause women to neglect the current children they have. It can cause alcohol and drug addiction, bipolar and schizophrenia. The cells in the body go crazy and bad stuff happens like breast cancer. So these are all in his notes. Imagine all this misinformation that's given. None of this is accurate. Next. So this is told to a Latino caller, and you can sort of see that, the difference here. Women face PTSD after getting their abortion. They really regret it. There is research that shows an abortion can lead to breast cancer. When a woman is pregnant, their bodies are getting ready to give birth, so their mammaries are changing. When you cut the mutation off in the middle of that process, the body freaks out. The physiological changes mutate the changes to become cancer cells. If the woman takes an abortion pill, but the baby hasn't been attached or there wasn't a baby there in the first place, it could cause damage to the uterus or could be fatal. So again, lots of misinformation, as you can see, but there's just sort of a difference of intensity and the amount of misinformation. And in some cases, no misinformation was given at all. Next. So if you look, for instance, at this table, did they discuss one or more abortion risks? And again, these are not true risks, but did they try in some way to discourage abortion? And what was really intriguing here is you can see 28% of the Latinos, they did not try to discourage abortion at all. So that was quite surprising to us, highly significant. Did they talk about the intense pain and the side effects and long-term pain and long-term psychological trauma, lasting guilt? In all those cases, you can see how much more common this was for our white callers than our Latino callers, and then to some extent to our Black callers. Told that they would have difficulty conceiving later. This was only mentioned to 14% of our Latino callers, but was like, 42% of our other callers, really enormous differences. And told that they would need to come in to check for ectopic pregnancy. This was told frequently to our white men, about 31%. Again, you can see the differences with our others. Next. So we also, remember we had that question, like, how long do we have to decide about abortion? And here we did see a difference about, did they give accurate information? So by accurate information, remember, this was pre-Dobbs. So we were looking for them to say, well, you really should try to make that decision in the first trimester, or you should make it as soon as possible. And that correct information was given to Black men 31% of the time, to white men only 14% of the time, and then Latinos 19%. So instead, they would just say things like, oh, it depends, or either they would say, oh, the time's already passed, or, you can wait all the way till, 36 weeks or whatever. They would just give them a range, or they would say, you just have to come in and we'll talk about it. Next. So did they explicitly mention this caller's race or religion? So we hear sometimes about Black genocide, et cetera. Did they say that? Did they try to explicitly discuss things? And we found this was infrequent, but there was a significant difference with our Latino callers. It did come up more, or they would talk particularly about well, they would presume that if he's Latino, then he has to be Catholic. And they would say, well, you know what the Catholic faith tells you, or something of that nature. But it wasn't as common as we had expected it might be. We also asked the men at the very end, just how did this call feel to you? Just your subjective assessment of this call. And we found that there was a difference by ethnicity. That only 14% of the white callers found it to be negative in some way, like, you know, they were rushed, or they were pushy or aggressive with them, or something like that. With our men of color, it was much higher. It was 21 to 23% of the calls. And this, again, was a little surprising, because you think they have an anti-abortion mission. Why would they be negative or pushy with anyone? You think they'd be as compassionate and caring, et cetera, as they could be with anyone who calls it. Next. So the negativity of the calls, interestingly enough, did seem to vary by state. And where it seemed to be the highest was in Illinois, particularly around the suburbs of Chicago. Our Latino callers really found a very hostile reception in particular. But also Oklahoma was quite high. Least was only 4% in Washington state found the call to be negative. California is about average, around 17%. Next. So what are our conclusions? Well, this was the first study ever that we're aware of to try to investigate male callers' experiences with crisis pregnancy centers. And we did find, just like the report that Catherine had cited, you know, all sorts of misinformation was being provided to our male callers. But the key issue was that it did seem that these CPCs were much more likely to try to understand and get to know our white callers, even though the amount of time spent on the call was similar. But sometimes, you know, people were put on hold or whatever, or they'd ramble. But the focus was much more on getting to understand the white collar and to discourage the white collar, as compared to the Black collar, and particularly also the Latino collar. So to us, this seemed, the implication was that they were prioritizing trying to save white babies from being aborted. So the upshot is that it seems that racism and xenophobia are prevalent in these CPCs, these randomly selected CPCs. And if you're wanting another reason to want to deny them public funding or protest against them, this gives you a little more ammunition. Thanks, everyone.
Great, thank you. And we had a couple of questions that came in about your study, Paula, while you were speaking. The first is the study published? I believe it's not published yet. Is that correct?
No, this is still raw data, and we are working on publications right now.
Okay, great. And then another question about sort of the methods. Could you talk a little bit more about what explicit mentions of race looked like for white callers? Were the comments specifically tied to Irish ethnicity or Roman Catholicism, or were there any kind of others?
With the white collars, it seemed entirely focused on the presumption that they were Catholic. And that was across the board. It was exceedingly rare for anyone to refer to the skin color. It was almost entirely focused on religion.
Okay, thank you. I also wanted to clarify something that I said that folks in the question and answer box corrected me on. So thank you to the folks from Essential Access Health who are on the call. While during the Trump administration, there were CPCs in California who received Title X funding. Currently, Essential Access Health is the sole Title X grantee for the state of California. And so at least in California, no Title X funding is going to CPCs anymore. So thank you. And if we have any other questions, please put them in the box.
Though we should mention that in other states, there's quite a lot of funding that's going to them, partly through the sales of certain types of license plates. There's also in some states that if an underage in other words, under 18 girl tries to seek an abortion through a judicial bypass because she can't get parental consent. So these are in states that require parental consent. The judges will often refer them first to a crisis pregnancy center before they will even discuss further whether they will grant them an abortion. So they unfortunately play a pretty large role in some places.
Yeah, definitely very important to mention. Another question that came in that I'm curious if you know, Paula, is are all CPCs all owned by white/European people or people of European ethnicity?
I don't know that they're all, many of them are religiously affiliated. So it's really churches that own them and run them. And I don't know if you would call it church white or European, but we didn't. I know when I've given this talk before, someone asked, did we know what the race ethnicity of the CPC person was, the receptionist or whoever took in the call? We have no way of knowing. We presume they were of various ethnicities, but we certainly didn't ask, and our callers, we didn't ask them to estimate or try to guess either.
And then we had another question. Do you know off the top of your head which states fund CPC with Title X funds? I don't off the top of my head. I would direct folks again to the Design to Deceive report, which is focused on not all 50 states, but has additional states besides California. What I can say is that this was a Trump administration policy. And so traditionally Title X funds go to family planning services. They're supposed to go to people who are providing comprehensive reproductive health care. But what we frequently see with conservative presidential administrations is diverting those funds to things like crisis pregnancy centers who, as we have talked about today, don't always and often don't provide actual medical care or prenatal care, but are kind of ideologically aligned with anti-abortion policies that are also being pushed by those same administrations. So it's gone back and forth several times, kind of depending on what presidential administration is in power, whether or not Title X funding can be going to crisis pregnancy centers.
And also I should mention that they have changed tactics over the years. If you read some of the Right to Life sites and others, so their tactic of adding in ultrasound capability to many of the centers is fairly recent, in the past, say, 15 years or so. And that is because they feel strongly that if a woman sees the ultrasound image, that will change her mind. And so that's a big push to get people to come into the center to take this ultrasound. And they sometimes push this because they say, oh, but you need to identify if you have an ectopic pregnancy. But as physicians will tell you, you can identify an ectopic pregnancy through other means. You don't need an ultrasound.
Thank you. There's two other questions for you, Paula, about your study. One was conversations by ethnicity. Did any of the Black or Latino callers feel that they were being encouraged to have their partners abort, or just less interest in their situations?
We had a couple of cases where when the guys start asking questions about abortion, they would say, well, why don't you just go to Planned Parenthood and ask those questions? So, you can take that as you will. We had, with our white collars, it was more likely that they will say things like that they were praying for them, or even get everyone on staff. This happened several times, and they'd put the guy on speakerphone and they'd all do like some prayers. It really would freak them out a bit. But it was just this intense amount of it, and in some cases, the negative, when the guy said it was negative, the white men, it was because the person on the phone was so emotional. So maybe that person had had an abortion that they regretted, and they were now just like oversharing the whole story, even though obviously he hadn't asked about that. And they were getting intensely, dramatic. And that was, it did make it hard on some of the callers. Like they said, I have to take a break. That's why it took a while, because sometimes it was just too much and they just needed a pause.
Yeah. And then also another question about your study. Did they ask the male callers about the race or ethnicity of their partner? I think you said that you the way that you provided that information was if they asked, it was the same, or?
Yeah, so we had like little backstory for the men. Like, what age they would give if it was asked, and or the age of the girlfriend, or how long they knew each other. So they had their little backstories. But also, if they asked about the race, then the man would say, oh, she's also Latina, or or Black, or whatever. But it never came up.
Thank you. There are a couple questions here that I think I can field too. One is, has there been any litigation to challenge the misleading and or false information provided at CPCs? I think this is kind of the inverse of what you're asking, but there was several years ago an effort to legislate against crisis pregnancy centers in California that was subject to a case that went up to the Supreme Court. That's NIFLA v. Becerra. And that was actually striking down a California law that would have required CPCs to post notices that they do not provide, that they don't have medical staff, and then also had information about how you could obtain a low cost or free abortion in California through Medi-Cal. That was found to be a free speech violation of the CPCs. And so the legislation that I mentioned earlier, AB 315, is much more narrow than that. It's not going to require any speech by the part of CPCs, but it will make it a false or misleading consumer practice in order to lie if you lie about what pregnancy services you provide. That legislation also currently is written to create a private cause of action. So an individual who has been misled by a crisis pregnancy center would be able to sue. And I believe that there's I don't remember the exact figure, but there's a figure attached that the person would be able to get as an award through that lawsuit if they're successful, sort of an inverse of the SB 8 legislation that what we have in Texas, where people are able to get money from the lawsuits. The other thing that I want to mention on that is, while this is new legislation that is working its way through too, the Attorney General of California has put out a statement that he believes that the current consumer protection laws are already make it illegal for somebody to lie about what pregnancy services they're providing. And so it would, under that advisory from the Attorney General, it would be possible for someone to try to bring a lawsuit for false or misleading consumer information that is provided by CPCs. This new legislation is just making that very clear, and then again, creating that private right of action. And then one other question that was asked is there any data if CPCs are more likely to encourage parenting versus adoption? I don't know off the top of my head about any particular research on that, but I will say that at least some of these CPCs have relationships with private foster care and adoption agencies. They are kind of all run by similar religiously based entities. And so there is some information out there about kind of the connection between CPCs and then these private agencies that are trying to recruit people to give up their children for adoption. I don't have any sources for that. I apologize, but there's some good kind of some sort of narrative work that has been done in the past about, for example, the girls that went away and kind of maternity homes that people used to be sent to, which unfortunately folks are talking about again, where there is that relationship between a CPC and a private adoption agency.
I see that somebody asked, did the caller's own perspectives change after going through this research? When they came into it, I would say most of them tilted pro-choice and or were neutral. And I don't think it changed after doing the research, but we didn't ask them specifically if it had.
Great, thank you. Well, we are right at 12:50, so I think we will wrap up. There was one final request in the chat for contact information, so I will put my contact information in the chat. But thank you all